The most embarrassing royal deaths of all time. What could be more tragic than a young king losing his father to treachery? Well, how about watching your dinner guests get beheaded right in front of you? Let's unravel this dark chapter of Scottish history. At just 6 years old, young James II of Scotland, affectionately nicknamed Slim Jimmy by modern historians, suddenly found himself thrust onto the throne. His father, King James the Fair, had just been assassinated in a brutal coup led by his own uncle, who had grand ambitions for the crown. Though the Queen, James's mother, survived the attack, she was shaken and chose to display her husband's body publicly, a move that sparked widespread outrage and a furious hunt for the assassins. Justice was swift, and the conspirators met gruesome ends. With the king dead, it was time to crown a new monarch. But 6-year-old James obviously wasn't ready to rule, so his mother took over as regent. Here's where things got messy. The Scots were, unsurprisingly, quite patriotic, and they weren't thrilled that the Queen hailed from England. A foreign regent was not the image they wanted for their new king. So she was nudged out of power, and in stepped James's much older cousin, Archibald Douglas. Archibald's reign as regent didn't last long. A fatal fever claimed him, and the task of protecting and guiding young James fell to two new guardians, Lord William Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston. Their mission was simple: keep the boy king safe. But the volatile Scottish court had no shortage of ambitious nobles vying for influence, and politics soon turned deadly. The most infamous example? The Black Dinner of 1440. Imagine this: a grand feast at Edinburgh Castle. Among the honored guests were 16-year-old William Douglas and his 10-year-old brother David, sons of the late Archibald Douglas, and potential threats to the king's authority. Midway through their meal, a black bull's head was slammed onto the table, a grim symbol of imminent death. Despite young James's tearful pleas, the two boys were dragged away and executed on the spot. If this sounds eerily familiar, that's because it inspired the infamous Red Wedding scene in Game of Thrones. Years passed, and James, now hardened by political strife, grew into his role. At 19, he married Mary of Guelders, and together they had 7 children, though one sadly died young. With his position solidified, James finally turned his attention to the lingering threat of the Douglas family. After a calculated campaign, he stripped them of their power and lands, becoming Scotland's undisputed ruler. Despite the ominous red birthmark covering half his face, earning him comparisons to fictional villains, James II proved to be a forward-thinking king. He mingled with commoners, championed education, founding the University of Glasgow in 1451, and embraced cutting-edge military technology, cannons. But fate can be cruel. In 1460, during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, a final English stronghold, James stood proudly beside one of his prized cannons. As he urged his men to fire, disaster struck. The cannon exploded, killing the king instantly at just 29 years old. And so, James II's reign ended with a literal bang, forever etched in history, and, quite fittingly, canon. Canidi. But here's the question: how might Scotland's future have changed if that fateful canon had held strong? The tragic tale of young Philip, the wayward heir of France. In the heart of the Capetian dynasty, the Kingdom of France found itself under the rule of Louis XVI, known rather unkindly to history as Louis the Fat. A more generous title today might be Louis the Body Positive, for beneath the jest lay a king who strove to strengthen his realm. Louis fathered 8 children, and this story centers on his eldest, young Philip. Or as he insisted, "Call me Philip." In keeping with Capetan custom to ensure an undisputed line of succession, the young prince was crowned co-king of the Franks at the tender age of 13, a time when most boys grappled with little more than adolescent restlessness. Although the apple of his father's eye, Philip soon proved to be a troublesome heir. Despite King Louis's efforts to mold him into a wise ruler, Philip met his father's lectures with indifference, resisted authority, and grew into a willful and disobedient youth. Chronicler Walter Map would later remark that the boy's arrogance and insolence rendered him a burden to all. Much like witnessing a modern child throwing a tantrum on the floor of a department store while the parent watches on, powerless and exhausted. Yet fate would soon take a dark turn, one that no amount of royal guidance could have prevented. On a crisp October day in 1131, 15-year-old Philip, enjoying the carefree thrills of youth, rode with his companions through the bustling streets of Paris. Mounted upon powerful steeds, 1-horsepower Mustangs of the medieval sort, the young nobles raced with reckless abandon, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. But as the headstrong prince led the charge, an unforeseen danger darted into their path. A small sable pig. The pig scuttled into the roadway, and in a heartbeat, Philip's horse stumbled violently over the creature. The prince was hurled from the saddle, his body colliding with the ground in a sickening cacophony of breaking bones. Unconscious and gravely injured, Philip lingered but a single day before succumbing to his wounds. His sudden death left King Louis and the royal family engulfed in sorrow, their dreams for the young heir cruelly shattered. And as for the hapless pig, one could only muse that it ought to have stayed safely at home, far from the path of destiny. The king who strained beyond the veil, the curious death of George II. In the year 1683, beneath the gray skies of Hanover, Germany, a fragile infant named George was born into the turbulent tides of royalty. This small child would one day ascend as George II, King of Great Britain, a man whose life was shaped by deep-seated rivalries and, ultimately, ended by an act as mundane as a morning trip to the lavatory. George's childhood was anything but harmonious. His father, George I, the first ruler of the Hanoverian era, was a tempestuous figure. The two, George, father and son, clashed incessantly. Their quarrels were no secret, erupting into fiery public disputes over politics, governance, and matters of the crown. The young prince harbored a particular disdain for his father's shadowy advisor, Robert Walpole, the man often credited as Britain's first prime minister and the true puppet master of the court. Picture the Wizard of Oz, only with a smaller head and far worse teeth. Eventually, the volatile relationship reached a breaking point. In a storm of royal displeasure, George I banished his son from the palace. But exile proved to be a blessing in disguise. Free from the oppressive court, George and his beloved wife enjoyed a tranquil life, far from the intrigues of the monarchy. That peace ended in 1727, when George I's death thrust his son onto the throne. At the age of 43, George II became king. His reign was a study in contrasts. He suppressed uprisings, nurtured the arts, laid early foundations for the coming Industrial Revolution, and even led his soldiers into battle well into his 60s. Yet, in the eyes of many of his English subjects, none of this could overshadow one simple fact. He was German. Prejudice lingered, stubborn as stone. As the years unfurled, the king aged. By 1760, now 76 years old, George II was a fading figure, blind in one eye, hard of hearing, and weary. On a cool October morning, he rose early as was his custom, sipped his ritual 6 a.m. hot chocolate, and excused himself to the lavatory. What happened next would etch his name in medical history. While seated upon his secondary throne, the king strained, perhaps too forcefully. Moments later, a loud crash echoed through the chambers. A servant burst in to find the monarch collapsed on the floor. Though quickly attended, George II was beyond saving. His life had slipped away. An autopsy revealed the cause: a thoracic aortic dissection, a catastrophic tear in the artery near his heart. The exertion of straining had triggered the fatal rupture. In seeking to relieve one burden, the king unwittingly cast off the ultimate one, his mortal life, and so ended the reign of George II in a final ironic twist that reminds us even kings must tread gently. Stay hydrated, indeed. Spike the king, who laughed himself to death. The curious fate of Martin the Humane. In a world where monarchs were often remembered with grim titles, the cruel, the mad, the terrible, there lived one sovereign whose legacy shone with rare warmth: Martin the Humane, King of Aragon. His title, bestowed by the people, whispered of gentler virtues in an era soaked in blood. But as fate would have it, the final chapter of Martin's life would unfold in a manner so strange, so whimsical, that it would ripple through history as one of the most peculiar royal demises ever recorded. At first glance, Martin seemed an exception to the brutal norms of kingship. True, he had reconquered Sardinia, quelled revolts, and even led crusades against the Moors in northern Africa, but compared to the savage rulers of the time, Martin ruled with a more tempered hand, striving for internal peace and stability. His was a kingdom where art, poetry, and courtly life flourished in a rare climate of tranquility. Yet peace has its price. Without the sharp edges of constant conflict to hone him, Martin's later years were marked by melancholy and excess. By 1410, at the age of 53, the king had grown heavy, both in body and spirit. The loss of his beloved wife and all 4 of his children had plunged him into profound grief. Though he had remarried a much younger cousin in hopes of producing an heir, the union proved fruitless. Childless, weary, and increasingly isolated, Martin turned to food for comfort, seeking solace in grand feasts within the echoing halls of his palace. And so it was that on one fateful evening, the king consumed an entire roasted goose, every succulent morsel. Bloated and breathless, he retired to his chambers, attempting to ease the discomfort of indulgence. In search of levity, Martin summoned his court jester. The jester arrived, only to be questioned about his tardiness. And here, dear reader, is where history tilts toward legend. "I was in the next vineyard," the jester replied with a sly grin, "where I saw a young deer hanging by its tail from a tree, as if someone had punished it for stealing figs." The jest struck the weary king as uproarious. He laughed and laughed and laughed uncontrollably for 3 hours, clutching his belly until he toppled from his bed. A sudden heart attack claimed him on the spot. Thus ended not only the life of Martin the Humane, but the 273-year reign of the House of Barcelona, with no heir to ascend the throne. Though some historians suggest alternate causes, plague, food poisoning, obesity, none can resist the curious magic of the tale, that a single absurd joke could topple a dynasty. The curious mind of a doomed young Archduke. Imagine for a moment a world where the grand halls of palaces echoed not with the clanking of swords or whispers of political intrigue, but with the fizz of chemical reactions and the scratch of a pen across parchment. Picture a young man of royal blood, born not to wage war or manipulate thrones, but to chase the mysteries of the natural world. An unusual figure amidst a sea of tradition-bound nobles. Such was Archduke Alexander Leopold of Austria, a prince unlike most of his lineage. While his peers immersed themselves in the relentless pursuit of power, Alexander wandered through the labyrinth of science, his mind captivated by forces unseen. He preferred the certainty of equations over the vagaries of court gossip, and the thrill of discovery over the empty pomp of royal banquets. This intellectual curiosity wasn't born in a vacuum. His father, the reform-minded Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, was an ardent champion of Enlightenment thought. He fostered an atmosphere where inquiry was not only tolerated, but encouraged, where even an emperor's son could indulge in the noble art of understanding the universe. Under his father's guidance, Alexander developed a fascination with chemistry, physics, and mathematics, often retreating from state affairs to immerse himself in the wonders of natural philosophy. Yet destiny is rarely kind to those who stray from its prescribed path. As the empire's complex web of territories demanded governance, Alexander was thrust into the political sphere. Though Hungary was technically outside the formal bounds of the Holy Roman Empire, it remained firmly under Habsburg influence. In a gesture both strategic and ceremonial, Emperor Leopold appointed his son to the post of Palatine of Hungary, a prestigious role meant to anchor imperial control. For a time, Alexander performed his duties diligently, navigating the volatile politics of the region. The shadows of revolution loomed large, with factions such as the Jacobin-inspired conspirators seeking to sever Hungary's ties to the empire. Ironically, some rebels proposed crowning Alexander as king, a proposition he firmly rejected. His loyalty to his father's vision of a united empire remained unshaken, and the rebellion was swiftly crushed. But even amidst these turbulent events, the young Archduke longed for the tranquility of scientific exploration. In 1795, weary of politics and yearning for the familiar comfort of his experiments, he returned to Vienna. It was there, within the ornate confines of Laxenburg Palace, that Alexander would meet his tragic end, not through war or treachery, but through a fatal embrace of the very curiosity that had set him apart, that a king with no power and a death that made headlines. When we think of kings, we often imagine grand rulers commanding armies, shaping history, or at least having a real say in how their country is run. But not every king fits that picture. Take Adolf Frederick of Sweden, for example. Crowned in 1751 during what was known as Sweden's Age of Liberty, Adolf's life as king was far from glorious. In fact, the title of king practically landed in his lap, but without the actual power to go with it. During this era, the Swedish parliament, filled with noble elites and powdered wigs, held the true reins of control. Adolf was little more than a ceremonial figure, a king in name, but not in authority. Despite sitting on the throne, he had little say in matters of state, and as a result, much of Sweden's leadership became complacent. While neighboring nations advanced their industries, expanded their influence, and built thriving economies, Sweden's progress stalled. Trade dwindled, innovation lagged, and the country's global standing slipped further behind. Adolf Frederick, by most accounts, wasn't a bad man, just an ineffective monarch caught in a system where he couldn't make much of a difference. He tried, at one point, to wrest more control back from Parliament, but his efforts fell flat. As a result, His reign is remembered as a peaceful but uneventful chapter in Swedish history. There were no great wars, no sweeping reforms, just a long lull where the kingdom drifted rather than thrived. Ironically, what history does remember about Adolf Frederick isn't his rule at all. It's how he died. The king's final moments became a story told and retold, filled with rich food, indulgence, and a cautionary tale about excess. Some say he quite literally ate himself to death. Though modern historians debate the accuracy of that claim, the legend of his last meal has cemented his place in the annals of quirky royal deaths. But before we get to that infamous supper, it's worth understanding a little more about how a king ended up with so little power, and why, in the end, it was his table manners, rather than his leadership, that earned him a lasting footnote in history. So, there you have it. That wraps up part 2 of embarrassing royal deaths. If you'd love to see a part 3, and trust me, there are plenty more bizarre stories to uncover, drop a comment below and tell me. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And subscribe so you won't miss any of the crazy tales coming up next. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you can check it out right here. Or feel free to explore more fascinating history videos right over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.